So welcome everybody. This is episode 13 of season 2 of Baseline Tech Talk Tuesday. And if you're joining us for the first time, you can catch all of our previous Tech Talk episodes on YouTube, and the handle Baseline Web Trading, which is all one word, on YouTube. Every previous episode that we've done is all in a nice playlist. And I'd recommend just accessing the playlist, and then you can bookmark just the playlist and come back to it any time. Quick introductions. Got myself. I'm Andy Humphrey, irrigation technology consultant for Baseline. We have Dan Conger, our training manager. And then joining us again today is Brandon from support.
Hello.
And I think
thanks for
Brandon
having me.
Joined us maybe 5 or 6 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I think this is actually my third time on the Tech Talks.
So it means you're doing good.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we brought Brandon on because today we're going to talk about the top 5 reasons a controller is not connected, or it's disconnected, or it's grayed out. And so, of course, these are all reasons that people call in to support, email, text regional sales managers, et cetera, is when their controller is not connected to BaseManager. So that's our topic for today. And one quick reminder, if you wouldn't mind, our goal for Tech Talk Tuesday is to build our community, our audience, our friends of Baseline. And the best way for us to do that is to have you guys invite your friends, colleagues, business associates, customers, clients, et cetera, to join us. So they can do that on baselinetechtalk.com is where you register. So with that, Dan, why don't we hand this over to you and get started?
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, so we are going to be talking about the reasons why a controller isn't connected, but even if we just back up and let's reiterate why this is important. You can do just about everything. You can do everything at the controller, but doing it at the controller doesn't always fit what you're after, right? And if we're talking about alerts or messages that are going to come out of the controller, we don't want them locked in the cabinet. We need to get them where we are. If we're across town, or if it's the middle of the night, I want to get that text message that something's going sideways on my site and hopefully let it react. But if we're not connected to BaseManager, there's lots of things I don't have.
Yeah, and listen, we realize that a big reason you purchase Baseline, use Baseline, is to access the data remotely, make changes remotely. And so got to have the controller connected to do it.
Exactly right. So I've got a few examples of controllers that aren't connected. So we're going to start off with gray. So here's my BaseManager map for my site level, and you can see my controller's gray right next to the lake. All my zones are gray. The only color coded icons I have are my custom markers. Everything is gray. So this is a prime example of a controller not connected. Or on quick view, everything's gray. All my zones and programs are gray. And then if you actually look at the devices, you can see they're disconnected as well. And if you're at the controller, you may have gray or you may have something else. So here's my controller, and right above 2R, it says BaseManager, or abbreviation for Base MGR. And right now mine's in a call wait. So it's going to cycle through that. So it's not able to make that connection all the way through.
Can you point that out, Dan, with your cursor?
Absolutely. Right up in here. Right. So if this is anything other than green, I'm not connected to BaseManager. On the 1000, it's inside a menu. But on the 3200, it's right there on the home screen. So anytime I see that, now obviously if I'm at the controller, there's some other signs that I'll get. But seeing gray remotely says we're not connected, and we can't do anything with the controller remotely. We have to physically go to the controller. So Brandon, when we were kind of talking about why a controller isn't connected, we're just spitballing ideas. We're like, okay, let's just start a big list of things. And they fell into 2 buckets, 2 categories. And one bucket was communication related, so network or device related. And the other one was hardware related. So let's start off with communication related. And I think the first one that we were talking about was related to a cell module or a cell modem. What can you tell us about cell modems and cell modules and why those might not be connected?
So if the signal quality or signal strength was low enough that it would lose connection from the cellular network, or if it was just bad enough that it was dropping a large amount of packets, then it would cause the controller to appear as offline.
So the cell carrier is goofy. They're having problems with their signal strength, or perhaps with your antenna. But quite basically, we could be saying it's the cell company's fault. They're causing problems.
It can be something with the equipment. It could be an outage that the carrier is aware of. It could be a local variable, right? Mm-hmm. It could be that the weather is bad and the signal strength was already middle of the road. There's a lot of variables to consider, but we sometimes see local interference causing the issue as well. If there's new structures being developed or something of that nature that's local, that causes interference and the quality to diminish, then we could see an offline controller scenario that way as well.
Brandon, while you're speaking about signal strength and quality, can you remind us what sort of qualifies or what good signal strength should be?
Well, I'm not sure I remember off the top of my head. There are standardized LTE signal strength and signal quality values that I use USAT, and they have good documentation for industry accepted signal strength and signal quality, whether it be good, fair, poor, to identify those thresholds. I don't remember the ranges off the top of my head. However, the good thing about the baseline controllers is that it accompanies the number, but then it also tells you next to it. So if you have a certain number for signal strength or a certain number for signal quality, and you're not exactly sure, if those are good or bad, the controller tells you. So it'll say good right next to it, or fair or poor. So you'll know when you see it if you're in the cell networks menu on the 3200 or looking at the cell info on a 1000.
Yeah, I'm just kind of thinking maybe that would be something worthwhile to document, make note of, perhaps, so that if installation contractor installs the controller, let's say this week and it's April, and then in July it happens to be offline, they could go back and reference what the signal strength or quality was at the time of installation, and is it the same now, or has it changed?
Agreed. Absolutely.
Nice. Now, sometimes cell carriers make changes to their network, and we were kind of working at are there any fixes on that cell modem or that cell module to if they've made carrier changes?
Things would be, we do offer AT&T and Verizon right now. Mm-hmm. So if there were any changes that were out of our control done by the provider, in an instance where the initial installation, one was giving us better signal than the other, and that changes, we can always switch it. Alternatively, high gain antennas, omnidirectional antennas are another solution for providing better reception at a location. And we do see this even now with 3G starting to be phased out. We're seeing less 3G hardware on the existing towers for providers being removed, replaced with, LTE or even 5G. So we do see some older projects with 3G calling and saying, why is my signal strength not like it used to be?
Sure.
So,
yeah. No, and I think what I was fishing for was sometimes I think just the old fashioned restart it or power cycle it.
Yep.
Can work with the cell modem too, right?
It's the tried and true troubleshooting tool with anything and everything.
And I think I've run into that even with my phone. My phone stays on when it's charged up, and my phone's on all 24/7. But anytime it gives me grief, I'm just going to turn it off and turn it back on again.
Yeah, and it's actually quite amazing how often electronics need to be power cycled these days. Even stuff you don't think has electronics, like the lights on my kitchen hood, right? Over the stovetop, weren't working on the touch button. I flipped the breaker to power cycle it. Works. Now it works.
Yep.
Needs to figure out what it does. Awesome. That's cool. Now we'd also put Ethernet or Wi-Fi, we kind of put those into that communication bucket. And we were kind of lumping them together. They could be separated. Let's talk about Ethernet or Wi-Fi network connections.
Okay. The outcomes are similar, but the causes can be different. So if you had that can, even sort of be a segue into a hardware failure aspect, if it happens to be something with the cable or something with the Ethernet port on either end, it can be a known network outage. It's
So let's break apart the known network outage. So I'm using a Cat 6 or Cat 5 cable to connect to the network on my site, and the network on my site is down. That would cause my BaseManager to not be able to connect, basically because I can't connect to the internet or I can't connect outside. That's a hard stop right there.
Yep.
And now how do you resolve that? From support in Idaho, how do you fix someone else's site network on site?
I don't.
Okay, excellent.
I just say, hey, we got to play the waiting game with your IT department, or, some people may have more control over it. If it happens to be a third-party hardware issue and like residents, they say, hey, I found out my modem or my router died, then they can replace it. But we don't always have that luxury, especially in commercial applications. So
right on.
Let's just stay there for a quick second, because I think it's there's maybe a little bit more we can talk about. So we've got a cable, this Ethernet cable, and it's essentially the same whether it's Wi-Fi or Ethernet, because it's still an Ethernet cable that plugs into the back of the face panel, right? So you're coming from the building Ethernet, or it's coming from the Wi-Fi module with an Ethernet cable. And so how do you know at the controller level, when you're looking at the controller, that the internet is the problem? What does it tell you on the display, or how do you know it can't go out on the internet?
Well, I check things such as, is the controller getting a valid IP address if it's using DHCP, because that IP address should be obtained automatically. The network should just assign an address out to it. So if it's receiving zeros or a self-assigned IP address, which begins with 169.254, that would tell us that it's not getting an IP address. And one little trick that I like to use personally with the 3200s is, if I'm unsure of the functionality of the Ethernet port and I don't have the luxury of taking it to another controller location, then I will disconnect the Ethernet cable and then reconnect it. And then typically the 3200 will recognize that a cable's been plugged back in, and it will go through its cycle of trying to connect to BaseManager. So you'll see it, maybe stuck in no cable, where it says BaseManager no cable, because it can't detect any sort of network being connected over that Cat 5 cable, and it will recycle through that. So,
and perfect, Dan. I was just going to ask you to pop this picture back up, because next thing I was going to ask you, Brandon, is what does BaseManager say? And of course, I'm sort of asking a question I already know the answer to. But when in Dan's picture there, it says call wait, right? What does that mean?
So it's going to cycle through a few different things, just attempting to get connected. So you're going to see call wait, call server, pending, starting. Those are just some of the things that it cycles through, attempting to make a connection to BaseManager. And then if it doesn't detect any sort of network connection, it will eventually default to no cable. Or if it does detect a network, but it's just unable to get out to BaseManager, then it'll just continue to cycle through this over and over again.
And this call wait, it's just, it's calling, it's waiting, it's calling, it's waiting. And if essentially, for lack of a better term, if the baseline server doesn't pick up, then it can't get through.
Yep.
Right. So on a network, so whether it's a Wi-Fi or cabled Ethernet network, what happens if let me put this differently. If a network administrator makes a change, if they change an IP address or they change something, that's going to impact our BaseManager connection too, right? Or quite possibly.
Yeah, it has the capacity to. Absolutely.
Right. So everything's fine. There's hardware, it's connected. Theoretically the network's going to do it, but that one port that we were connected to, or however it is back on the router or in their hub. Yeah. So essentially nobody has the user nor base support has access to that one. That could happen with Wi-Fi as well, right? If someone changes the Wi-Fi password, if you're connected via Wi-Fi, that would do the exact same thing. It's just denying access to that.
Yep, absolutely.
Yep, and we all know that you can be connected to Wi-Fi, but that's different than being connected to the World Wide Web. So just because the modem also has a Wi-Fi connection and a signal, and it's connected to the Wi-Fi router, doesn't mean the router's letting it get out to the world or get to the baseline server. Right.
Yep. Same with an Ethernet connection. You can have a network connection without being connected to the internet or being connected to our server. So,
yep.
Right. So good point.
Probably a good rule of thumb would be to know how your controller is connected, right? So let's say you are a contractor that has 20 controllers in their account. They may not all be connected the very same way. 5 might be on cell modem, 10 could be on Ethernet, some could be Wi-Fi. So maybe have some kind of documentation that reminds you, how is this controller connected? So when it comes time to troubleshoot the disconnect, you maybe know where to go.
Yep. Even in Ethernet radio applications, if you're aware of how it's connected and you see, oh, well, my gateway is online, but I got 1-2 controllers that aren't connected, then we can, assume that the network is working and that we need to go investigate the radios.
Yeah. And it's kind of an interesting, it's not a dilemma, but the opportunity we all have here together is Baseline offers many different ways, or almost like an open availability of ways to connect to the internet because of the Ethernet port. You use all kinds of devices, whether it's a Baseline, manufactured device or a third-party device. And at the same time, those connection opportunities can make it a little bit more cumbersome to troubleshoot because not every controller is the same. And if we only had cell, we would have one like troubleshooting tree. But because there's lots of choices, it's not that, it's just a little bit more complicated, especially if you call Brandon and he does not know how your controller is connected.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Absolutely. And we have all the same visibility as well. So when, we receive those types of calls and the controllers are offline, we have that same visibility. So it's not much.
So the other big bucket that we talked about was hardware. So the first one I guess it's not communication. So it's going to impact communication. The most important one that I came up with, or that we talked about, was about power supply. So a circuit breaker that's tripped, what does that look like to you? What does it look like to the user?
Yeah, that one is much more straightforward. So it's a lot nicer to diagnose when we have that type of scenario. It's very easy for us to just validate incoming power, outgoing power on the 24-volt side or secondary side of the transformer, the control board fuse, and that the display is fully booting. Because a partially booting display, or if there is some sort of boot issue to where it's not fully booting, will not connect to BaseManager.
Yeah.
So we'll see that.
Let's come back to that boot thing, because I want to dive into that a little more. But I think there's a little bit more on power. So a circuit breaker or any kind of incoming power, as support, you don't have any control over that. The contractor doesn't have any control over that. It's somebody else is going to be working on that one. And so that's right. And I'm a big proponent of contractors owning and knowing how to use a multimeter and being able to figure out what your power source looks like, to find out if it's 100 volts or if it's 118 volts, to be able, there's a difference there to understand that. So I think there's a real value in that. What about things so let's say they do have power, but not all the way. So fuses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we do see some fuse issues where if there's a short in the field, that's going to be the large majority of it's going to be the cause. A large portion of the time for the control board fuse blowing. Is a short in the field. All of our fuses, fast blow or slow blow, are rated for 2 amps. So if the short exceeds that, we'll see a control board fuse blow. And once that fuse blows, it cuts power to everything. So you won't have any LEDs in the controller. You won't have anything on the display, no LEDs on the display, nothing like that.
Okay.
Yeah. And keep in mind, I will mention that, which seems obvious, but let's say you're at home or you're, just using mobile access on your phone, and you bring up the controller, right? This is where this sort of whole conversation starts, is my controller's gray, it's offline. Mm-hmm. Well, all these things we're talking about here, especially power failure, that is seen remotely as a controller disconnected.
Yep.
And so a lot of times either I'll get calls or you'll get calls, or there's questions about the controller that appears to be, quote unquote offline, but we really need to have, verification, validation that it's powered up. And unless there's validation that it's powered up, that could be the problem. And a lot of times it is, especially on like a spring startup where no one's really been looking at this controller for a long time. Somebody may have just cut the power to it. Maybe there was a short in the field, like you just mentioned, and there's no power. And so it seems kind of silly, to have to go power, but maybe there's someone else on site that can just walk over to the controller, open the door, and see if the display's on, and can just be on the phone and help verify that there's power to it. Because there's not a whole lot me or Dan or you, Brandon, can do. And we really have to be careful about not chasing a cell modem signal strength issue for no reason, when it could just simply be the controller's powered off.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. We've all seen it. I'm sure our customers who happen to have off seasons and distributors in those areas have seen it. A lot can happen in those off seasons. So,
yep. And I would say, if you rewind the clock to the days when you'd call, tech support for your computer, your laptop not working, and the first thing I'd ask you, is your computer plugged in and powered up? Of course it is. And like, oh no, it isn't. I'm going to hang up in shame because they can't help you because it's not plugged in. Like, never mind.
No, it happens to everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then we do have, because we have multi-users on controllers, you could have one user that literally knows the controller doesn't have power. And then you have another user that either works for the company or is a third-party consultant, et cetera, and they access the controller and they say, hey, it's offline. But meanwhile, the managing company knows this. And so it's just nice to try to get everything organized. Really step one, validate it has power and the fuses aren't blown, et cetera. If this were a troubleshooting tree, that would be step one.
Right.
Yeah, definitely the best course of action in an offline scenario is, what's the most efficient way for me to get in front of the controller and do an initial inspection? And then you have to ask yourself, if you want baseline support on the phone when you're making, that initial inspection, then, feel free to give us a call. But as far as remote support, if, we're remote, you're remote on both ends of the phone, not going to be a whole lot happening.
Right. Right. Then you'd mentioned about a controller not booting, and I want to, before we dive into that one, I want to remind everybody that we say a controller, but really it's a computer, right? Because this is running, the 3200 is running CE, Windows CE, so it's running actual computer firmware. So, what do you mean by a computer not booting or stuck in a boot screen?
Yeah, so there have been instances where we've seen a display stuck at a Windows desktop screen or the baseline logo, where the status light, LED light may be on, but the display doesn't appear to be booting at all. Those are just some of the things that we've seen. That's the display receiving power. It's partially booting, but it's not fully booting. So it's not operational at any capacity.
Well, what would cause? I mean, there's got to be a cause for something for a computer to reboot. My computer just doesn't reboot on its own. There's going to be something that initiates that, right? Most likely an interruption, a momentary interruption on power would probably cause a controller reboot.
Yeah, that could cause a controller reboot. Yep.
Okay.
So if we happen to see a short in the field that caused a control board failure, as opposed to the fuse being blown, it could potentially cause the control board and the display to no longer be able to talk to each other. The display does have a feature built into it that if it can't communicate with the control board, after 10 minutes, it'll automatically reboot itself. So that's a, not often occurrence, but we've seen it. So there are a couple different things that could cause a reboot on a controller. Yeah.
How about an overcurrent, Brandon? Does that ever trigger a reboot?
Well, the overcurrent itself doesn't, but then we just get back to if the overcurrent, and this is more older, right? Because since, I started, we've made firmware progress, hardware progress to protect our controllers from these failures. And such as, after 5 times of seeing an overcurrent, it permanently shuts down the 2-wire path, our new control board. These are all things that we've done to greatly protect our hardware against failing in these field shorts, because we can't always control it. I mean, a lot of times field shorts are completely out of everyone's hands, and we want to protect our hardware when those things happen. But back in the past, we would see if an overcurrent was left on the system for long enough, we could see control board failure, which, there are small instances of that causing the display and the control board to not talk to each other anymore.
Yep.
But most of the time it wouldn't.
Okay. I've got one kind of question here, Dan, before we sort of get towards the end. Does subscription play into disconnected at all?
Good question. It does not.
Okay. So let's talk more about that. So let's say your subscription runs out. The controller stays connected?
Yes. So since we no longer charged for SIM for cell service on a yearly basis, we completely did away with that. That completely voided any example of the controller being offline due to non-payment. That will not happen anymore. The only exception would be is if your controller was offline for a real long time when we still did that, and the SIM happens to be suspended. But
so now when the subscription expires, it goes to live view only, right? But it should stay and remain connected, just live view only.
Yep. When we've been getting people calling in, I've been relaying that, saying we will never take a controller offline due to non-payment.
Cool.
So live view just being that super stripped down version of BaseManager. You still have remote access to it. It would be like you're standing in front of the controller. Real quickly, you're going to realize it's not BaseManager, and you want to get that subscription renewed. But that's great to know that a disconnect will never happen because of that. Excellent. So one thing that I think is kind of really important, and we've kind of teased on this one, is where can I do all these repairs, all of these ways to address a disconnect? Where does that happen? It happens in front of the controller. Absolutely right. Because the power supply out, a cell modem that needs to be reset, a network connection, a Wi-Fi connection, all of those are at the site. And as Andy alluded to, maybe you need to go there. Maybe you've got someone on site that can verify that, but it's not anything that's going to happen remote. And if you think about it, to do any programming or do any work on your controller, you need to have it connected.
Yeah, and Brandon, confirm this, but I believe that everything on a baseline system has been designed so that after a power cycle, it reconnects. Controller boots up, everything reconnects to BaseManager. So if somebody on site if you just said, "Hey, I want you to go on site," or if you're on site, verify that it has power. If it does, can you just do a power cycle? If they perform that, it should try to reconnect all by itself without any button pushing, menu changes, nothing, right?
Yep, exactly. If it was connected when it was booted and you unplug it for 5 seconds or you unplug it for 6 months, when you boot it back up, if everything is in order still, it will reconnect on its own.
Beautiful. Right. So that should probably be like step number 1 for users, whether that's end user, contractor, distributor, verify power, do a hard power cycle on everything, wait 5 minutes or so, see if it gets reconnected. If it doesn't, now we're not really troubleshooting the hardware as much as we're now troubleshooting the connection, whether that's cell, Ethernet, or Wi-Fi, radio, etc. It's not going to be the physical hardware anymore.
Beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. If the display is fully booted up, that's the entire hardware checklist just scrapped. We don't have to do any of it, because if there are any hardware issues, you're going to see no power or the display not fully booting. So if it is all the way up and you can navigate it, operate valves, all that good stuff, the hardware is not even in question.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, here we are. It's 1:31. Dan, we hit it right on target this week.
Beautiful. And now
appreciate the topic. And Brandon, great to see you. Thanks for all of the insight.
Yeah.
And
thanks for having me, guys.
Guys that you're on with us today, remember that a lot of you are sort of the first line of not defense, but you're, field level. So if you have customers that their controllers aren't connected, just remember some of the things that we talked about. Mm-hmm. And support is here for all of you, but we would obviously prefer when support calls come in that they're truly as technical as possible, so that we can be helping the most technical calls that come in versus the ones that are more basic, which hopefully what we talked about today can help cover some of that. And Dan, what's on tap for next week?
Next week, we're going to talk about flow and flow devices and what you might use when as well.
Okay. So flow meters, flow sensors, all that kind of stuff, what to use, when, where, why. Exciting. That's a big topic these days. So,
yeah, right on. Absolutely.
Yeah. Guys, remember, invite friends, colleagues, consultants, clients. We would love to have as many of you as possible join us on Tech Talks. And if you want to forward this episode to someone else, remember, it'll be on YouTube in probably a day or two. Mm-hmm. And as Chris would say, go out, be safe, have fun. And we'll see you guys next week.
All right. Thanks all. Good to see y'all. Take care.
Bye, everybody.